Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked into the Senate hearing room with a manila folder that would change everything. Senator Tim Scott sat confidently at the witness table, his polished smile ready for what he thought would be another easy political performance. But what Crockett pulled out of that folder in the next 30 seconds left Scott completely speechless, and sent shock waves through the entire political establishment. The room fell dead silent as Crockett held up a document that nobody knew existed. Scott's face went from confident to confused to absolutely terrified in a matter of seconds. What she was about to reveal would expose a hidden agenda so shocking that even his own Republican colleagues couldn't believe what they were hearing. This wasn't just another political hearing. This was the moment when one of the most trusted voices in conservative politics got completely exposed, and America watched it happen live on C-SPAN. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of the political drama that's shaking up Washington. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. The document in Crockett's hand contained evidence that would destroy everything Tim Scott had built his career on, and she was about to use it to tear down one of the Republican Party's biggest stars right in front of the nation. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know who these two political powerhouses really are, and what brought them to this moment. Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old Democrat from Texas, has been making waves in Congress since day one. A former civil rights attorney from Dallas, she's known for her sharp legal mind and fearless approach to taking on powerful opponents. Crockett grew up in a working-class family and fought her way through law school, building a reputation for never backing down from a fight. In Congress, she's become the voice that asks the questions nobody else wants to ask. Tim Scott, the 58-year-old Republican senator from South Carolina, has been called the future of conservative movement. As one of the few black Republicans in the Senate, Scott has carefully crafted an image as a principled conservative who rose from poverty to become one of the most influential voices in his party. His personal story of growing up with a single mother and working his way up from insurance sales to the Senate has made him a Republican superstar. But here's what makes this confrontation so important. For months, Crockett had been investigating something that didn't add up about Scott's recent policy positions. While Scott publicly supported certain civil rights initiatives, behind the scenes, something completely different was happening. Sources had been whispering about secret meetings, hidden donors, and policy positions that contradicted everything Scott claimed to believe. The stakes couldn't be higher. Scott was being considered for major leadership positions in the Republican Party, possibly even a future presidential run. His reputation as an honest, principled conservative was his greatest political asset. If Crockett could prove what she suspected, it wouldn't just destroy Scott's career, it would send shock waves through the entire Republican establishment. This hearing was supposed to be about voting rights legislation, a routine political theater where both sides would state their positions, and nothing would change. But Crockett had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence that would turn this routine hearing into a political earthquake. The room was packed with reporters, congressional staff, and political insiders. C-SPAN cameras were rolling, capturing every moment for a national audience. Neither Scott nor his team had any idea what was coming. They thought they were walking into another opportunity for Scott to showcase his conservative credentials. They had no idea they were walking into a trap that had been months in the making. The hearing started exactly as everyone expected. Senator Scott took a seat at the witness table, adjusting his tie and flashing that confident smile that had made him a Republican favorite. He looked around the packed hearing room with the ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. The morning sunlight streamed to the tall windows behind him, creating an almost angelic glow around his perfectly styled hair. The committee chair, Senator Patricia Williams from California, called the hearing to order with the traditional gavel strikes that echoed through the marble-lined room. The ornate chamber with its rich mahogany panels and oil portraits of past senators seemed to embrace Scott like an old friend. This was his domain, his comfort zone, the place where his polished rhetoric had made him a star. We're here today to discuss the Voting Rights Advancement Act, Williams announced, her voice carrying a formal tone of congressional procedure. Our first witness is a distinguished senator from South Carolina, Timothy Scott. The questioning began with softball questions from Republican committee members, exactly as Scott's team had prepared for during their morning strategy session. Everything was going according to plan. Senator Scott asked the first Republican questioner, Senator James Bradley from Texas, his voice warm and inviting. Can you share your thoughts on the importance of voting rights in America? Scott leaned into the microphone, his voice smooth and practiced, carrying that slight Southern accent that made him so appealing to voters across the political spectrum. Thank you, Senator Bradley. As someone who has experienced the struggles of poverty and discrimination firsthand, I believe strongly in protecting every American's right to vote. However, we must also ensure the integrity of our elections. It was the same speech Scott had given dozens of times before, refined through countless practice sessions and focus groups. The words flowed effortlessly, hitting all the right emotional notes while carefully avoiding any specific commitments. The Republican committee members nodded approvingly, some even smiling as Scott delivered lines they had heard before but never grew tired of hearing. Scott seemed completely in his element, his confidence growing with each friendly question. His team sitting in the gallery behind him looked relaxed and confident. His chief of staff Margaret Chin was even checking her phone casually, probably planning Scott's afternoon schedule. His communications director David Rodriguez was taking notes, but seemed more focused on crafting positive social media posts about Scott's performance than preparing for any serious challenges. The local South Carolina reporters in the gallery were already writing their stories in their heads. Scott delivers a strong defense of election integrity, or Senator Scott brings personal experience to voting rights debate. This was supposed to be another routine victory lap for one of the Republican Party's most effective messengers. Then it was time for the Democratic committee members to ask their questions. The first few Democrats asked predictable questions about voter ID laws and election access. Senator Maria Gonzalez from California questioned Scott about accessibility for disabled voters, while Senator Robert Thompson from New York focused on rural voting locations. These were standard Democratic talking points that Scott had prepared for extensively. Scott handled them with ease, sticking to his talking points and maintaining his calm demeanor. He spoke eloquently about common sense measures and protecting election integrity while ensuring access. His responses were perfectly calibrated, conservative enough to satisfy his base while modern enough to avoid controversy. His confidence was growing with each softball question, and he even allowed himself a small smile when Senator Thompson seemed satisfied with his answer about rural polling stations. But then Jasmine Crockett's turn came. She sat quietly for a moment, looking down at the manila folder in front of her. The room was relaxed, expecting another routine exchange. Scott even smiled slightly in her direction, thinking he knew what was coming. Senator Scott, Crockett began, her voice calm but with an edge that made people in the room pay attention. You've spoken beautifully today about your commitment to voting rights and protecting democracy. Scott nodded, still confident. Yes, Congresswoman, it's one of my core beliefs. That's interesting, Crockett continued, opening her folder slightly, because I have some documents here that suggest your private actions don't match your public statements. The room's energy shifted immediately. Scott's smile faltered slightly, but he tried to maintain his composure. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Congresswoman. Crockett pulled out the first document from her folder. Are you familiar with the Heritage Foundation's private donor meetings that took place in Charleston last month? Scott's face went pale. The Heritage Foundation meetings were supposed to be completely confidential, attended only by major conservative donors and select politicians. How could Crockett possibly know about them? I attend many meetings, Congresswoman. I'd have to refresh my memory about specific details. Let me help refresh your memory, Crockett said, her voice getting stronger. Because I have the meeting notes right here. She held up a document, and cameras zoomed in to capture the moment. Scott's team in the gallery looked panicked, frantically whispering to each other and checking their phones. According to these notes, You told a room full of donors that your public support for voting rights expansion was necessary political theater, and that you were committed to privately working against the very legislation you publicly claimed to support. The room erupted. Republican committee members started shouting objections, but the committee chair called for order. Scott sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, clearly unprepared for this level of detailed information. Furthermore, Crockett continued, not giving Scott a chance to recover. These same notes indicate that you received substantial financial commitments from donors, specifically because you promised to be what they called a trusted voice against civil rights expansion. Scott finally found his voice. Congresswoman, I don't know where you got those alleged documents, but I can assure you they don't represent my positions accurately. Really? Crockett asked, pulling out another document. Because I also have recordings. The word recording sent a chill through the entire room. Scott's face went from pale to gray. Congresswoman, I think we should verify the authenticity of any alleged recordings before proceeding, interrupted a Republican committee member. Oh, they've been verified, Crockett replied with a slight smile. In fact, they've been verified by 3 independent audio analysis firms. Would you like to hear them, Senator Scott? Scott looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. His carefully constructed, confident demeanor was crumbling before everyone's eyes. The Republican committee members were frantically trying to figure out how to help him, but there was nowhere to hide. I think there may be some misunderstanding about the context of any private conversations, Scott said. Weekly context. Crockett's voice rose with indignation. Senator, you told a room full of wealthy donors that black voters were too unsophisticated to understand complex voting procedures, and that making voting easy would lead to what you called unqualified participation in democracy. What context makes that acceptable? The room exploded again. This time even some Republican committee members looked shocked and disgusted. Scott's own team looked like they wanted to run from the room. But Crockett wasn't finished. She had one more bomb to drop. And finally, Senator Scott, I have documentation showing that you received over $2.3 million in dark money contributions, specifically tied to your commitment to oppose voting rights legislation, while maintaining your public image as a civil rights supporter. She held up a thick stack of financial documents. This money came from organizations with direct ties to groups that have spent decades trying to suppress black voting rights. The same groups your public persona claims to oppose. Scott sat in stunned silence. The confident, polished politician who had walked into the room was gone, replaced by someone who looked completely defeated and exposed. The committee chair called for a brief recess, but the damage was done. As Scott stumbled out of the room, followed by his panicked staff, everyone knew that nothing would ever be the same for the Republican Party's rising star. When the hearing resumed after the recess, Senator Tim Scott looked like a completely different person. Gone was the confident smile and polished demeanor. His face was drawn, his hands shaky, and his usual commanding presence had evaporated. His staff had clearly spent the break trying to figure out damage control. But there was no coming back from what Jasmine Crockett had just revealed. Crockett meanwhile looked calm and focused. She had spent months preparing for this moment, and everything was going exactly according to plan. She knew she had Scott cornered, and she was about to deliver the knockout blow. Senator Scott, she began as the hearing resumed, I noticed you took some time to consult with your staff during the break. Have you had a chance to remember these Heritage Foundation meetings now? Scott cleared his throat nervously. Congresswoman, I want to be clear that any statements taken out of context from private meetings don't represent my full positions on these important issues. Out of context. Crockett's eyebrows shot up. Senator, let me play you some of that audio so you can provide the proper context for America. She nodded to the committee's technical staff, and suddenly, Scott's own voice filled the hearing room through the sound system. The audio quality was crystal clear, and every word was unmistakable. Scott's recorded voice said, Look, I have to say certain things in public to maintain my credibility with black voters and moderate Republicans, but everyone in this room knows that expanding voting access is really about diluting the votes of people who understand how government should work. We can't let emotion override common sense just because some people want to make voting as easy as buying groceries." The room fell completely silent. Even the Republican committee members looked shocked and disgusted. Scott's face turned bright red as his own words condemned him. But the recording continued. "The truth is some communities just aren't ready for the full responsibilities of democracy. I know that sounds harsh, but we have to be realistic about who should be making decisions that affect all Americans." Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. Scott looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Crockett let the silence hang in the air for a long moment before speaking. "Senator Scott, would you like to provide context for those statements?" Scott's voice was barely above a whisper. "Congresswoman, those statements don't reflect my true beliefs." "Really?" Crockett pulled out another document. "Because this is a signed agreement between you and the Heritage Foundation donors, dated just 2 weeks ago, in which you promised to maintain public support for voting rights while working through back channels to ensure voting access limitations remain in place." She held up the document so the cameras could see Scott's signature clearly at the bottom. "You literally signed a contract promising to lie to the American people about your real positions on voting rights, and you received $2.3 million for that promise." Scott tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "I think there's been some misunderstanding about the nature of those agreements." "Oh, there's no misunderstanding," Crockett said, her voice rising with righteous anger. "You took money to pretend to support civil rights while secretly working to undermine them. You use your identity as a black man to give cover to policies that would hurt black communities. That's not a misunderstanding, Senator. That's a betrayal." The room erupted again. But this time it was different. Republican committee members weren't defending Scott anymore. They were sitting in stunned silence, realizing that one of their party's biggest stars had just been exposed as a fraud. But Crockett had saved the best for last. "And, Senator Scott, there's one more thing America needs to know about your hidden agenda." She pulled out a final document. This one marked confidential in large red letters across the top. But what made this document even more shocking was the letterhead. It wasn't from Heritage Foundation. It was from Scott's own Senate office, written on official United States Senate stationery. "This is a strategy memo you wrote to Heritage Foundation leadership outlining your long-term plan to use your position as a prominent black Republican to neutralize civil rights opposition by becoming the trusted voice that explains why voting restrictions are actually good for black communities." The gasps from the gallery were audible. Now even a usually stoic C-SPAN camera operators seemed to lean in closer to capture every detail of this bombshell revelation. She began reading directly from the memo in Scott's own handwriting, her voice rising with each damning sentence. "By positioning myself as a reasonable black conservative who supports common sense voting measures, I could provide cover for more aggressive restrictions that would be politically impossible if proposed by white Republicans. Black voters will be less likely to oppose measures that come with my endorsement, even if those measures ultimately limit their own political power." But Crockett wasn't finished reading. The memo continued, and each word seemed to hit Scott like a physical blow. "The key is maintaining credibility with black churches and community organizations, while gradually shifting the conversation toward election security concerns. My personal story of rising from poverty provides perfect cover for policies that might otherwise be seen as discriminatory." The entire room was in shock. Several reporters were frantically typing on their phones trying to get this breaking news to their editors. Even the Republican committee members looked disgusted and betrayed, realizing that one of their party's most trusted voices had been playing an elaborate con game. But the most devastating part of the memo was still coming. "And once we establish the precedent that voting restrictions could be civil rights friendly when proposed by the right messenger, we can expand these policies nationwide. The beauty of the strategy is that opposition will be labeled as attacking a black conservative rather than defending voting rights. The cynicism and calculated manipulation revealed in Scott's own words left everyone speechless. This wasn't just political disagreement or even corruption. This was a deliberate strategy to use Scott's race and personal story as weapons against the very communities he claimed to represent. The entire room was in shock. Even the C-SPAN cameras seemed to zoom in closer to capture every expression of disbelief and disgust on the faces of committee members. Senator Scott, Crockett said, her voice now filled with moral authority, you literally wrote a playbook for using your race to manipulate black voters into supporting policies that would suppress their own voting rights. How do you explain that to the American people? Scott sat in complete silence for nearly a full minute. The hearing room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning running. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. I think I need to consult with my legal counsel before making any further statements. Your legal counsel? Crockett asked, with incredible emphasis. This isn't a court of law. This is a congressional hearing about voting rights. And you've just been exposed as someone who took money to undermine the very rights you were elected to protect. The American people deserve an explanation right now. But Scott was done. He stood up shakily from the witness table, his hands trembling as he gathered his papers. I think this hearing has gone far enough off track, he said weakly. I'll be submitting written responses to these allegations through proper channels. Running away, Crockett called out, as Scott headed for the door. The same way you've been running away from your real responsibilities to the people who trusted you. Scott didn't turn around. He walked out of the hearing room, followed by his staff, leaving behind a room full of shocked politicians and a national audience that had just watched one of the biggest political exposures in recent memory. As the door closed behind Scott, Crockett looked directly into the C-SPAN cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, what you just witnessed is exactly why we need transparency in politics. Senator Scott betrayed not just his constituents but every American who believes in the fundamental right to vote. This isn't about Republican versus Democrat. This is about truth versus lies, integrity versus corruption. She held up the stack of documents one more time. These documents prove that there are politicians in both parties who will say anything in public while working against those same principles in private. But today, at least one of them got caught. The hearing room erupted in applause, and across the country, social media exploded with reactions to what everyone was already calling one of the most shocking political exposures in American history. Within minutes of Tim Scott walking out of that hearing room, the political world completely exploded. What Jasmine Crockett had just revealed wasn't just a scandal, it was a political earthquake that sent shock waves through every level of American government. The first reactions came from inside the hearing room itself. Republican committee members sat in stunned silence, clearly trying to process what they had just witnessed. Several of them were frantically texting, presumably trying to figure out how their party should respond to having one of their biggest stars completely exposed as a fraud. Democrat committee members meanwhile looked like they couldn't believe what they had just seen. Even though Crockett was on their side, many of them were shocked by how completely she had dismantled Scott's career in less than an hour. But the real explosion happened online. Within 30 minutes, #TimScottExposed was trending #1 on Twitter, with over 200,000 tweets, and climbing. The audio clips of Scott's recorded statements were being shared thousands of times per minute. TikTok videos breaking down the scandal were already going viral, with young people expressing shock and outrage at Scott's betrayal. The reaction from Black Twitter was particularly intense. Many users expressed feeling personally betrayed by someone they had seen as a trailblazer, even if they disagreed with his politics. Comments like, "He really sold us out for money and this is why we can't trust any of them," flooded social media feeds. Conservative influencers were in complete chaos, trying to figure out how to respond. Some tried to defend Scott, claiming the evidence was fabricated or taken out of context, but the audio recordings were too clear, and Scott's signature on the Heritage Foundation agreement was too obvious to deny. One prominent conservative commentator tweeted, "I've defended Tim Scott for years, but there's no defending this. If these documents are real, He needs to resign immediately. Liberal politicians and activists meanwhile were having a field day. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just showed America what real accountability looks like when politicians lie to our faces. We need representatives brave enough to expose the truth." But the most devastating reactions were coming from Scott's own constituents in South Carolina. Local news stations were already interviewing voters who had supported Scott for years, and their feelings of betrayal were obvious. "I voted for him because I thought he understood what people like me go through," said one elderly black woman from Charleston. "To find out he was working against us this whole time. I don't think I can ever trust another politician again." A white conservative voter from Greenville was equally upset. "I supported Scott because I thought he was honest and principled. If he'll lie about something this important, what else has he been lying about?" The financial markets even reacted to the scandal. Heritage Foundation's nonprofit status was being questioned, and several major donors were already distancing themselves from the organization. Stock prices for companies tied to Heritage Foundation leadership dropped significantly in after-hours trading. News networks scrambled to get reaction from other politicians. The Democratic leadership was mostly staying quiet, letting the scandal speak for itself. But Republican leaders were in full crisis mode. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's office released a brief statement. "These are serious allegations that deserve serious investigation. Senator Scott will have the opportunity to respond to these claims through appropriate channels." But privately, Republican sources were telling reporters that Scott's political career was effectively over. "There's no coming back from this one," GOP strategist told CNN. "He can't claim he was misunderstood when we have his own voice on tape and his signature on documents. The party is going to have to cut him loose." The Heritage Foundation itself was in damage control mode. Within hours of the hearing, they released a statement claiming that the documents revealed by Crockett were taken out of context, and that their organization has always supported voting rights for all Americans. But the statement was so weak and obviously defensive that it only made the scandal worse. By evening, major news networks had made the Scott exposure their lead story. CNN's Anderson Cooper opened his show by saying, "Good evening. We begin tonight with what may be one of the most stunning political betrayals in modern American history." Fox News, clearly struggling with how to cover a scandal involving a prominent Republican, focused on questioning the authenticity of Crockett's evidence. But even their own legal analysts admitted that the documentation appeared genuine and damaging. MSNBC went all in on the story, with Rachel Maddow dedicating her entire show to analyzing the implications of Scott's exposure. "This isn't just about one corrupt politician," she said. She reveals a systematic effort to use black political figures as cover for policies designed to suppress black political power. The implications for the Republican Party were massive. Scott had been considered a potential presidential candidate for 2028, and his appeal to moderate voters and black conservatives had made him valuable to party leadership. With Scott's credibility destroyed, Republicans had lost one of their few effective messengers to diverse communities. But the implications went far beyond just one party. Political scientists were already calling the Scott scandal a watershed moment that would change how voters evaluate politicians. Authenticity: when a politician's private statements directly contradict their public positions. To this degree, it breaks something fundamental in the democratic process, said Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a political science professor at Georgetown University. Voters need to be able to trust that politicians mean what they say, even if they disagree with those positions. The scandal also raised serious questions about dark money in politics. The $2.3 million Scott received from Heritage Foundation donors highlighted how wealthy interests could essentially purchase politicians' private loyalty, while allowing them to maintain contradictory public positions. Campaign finance reform advocates seized on the Scott scandal as evidence that the current system was completely broken. "This is exactly why we need complete transparency in political donations," said Sarah Chin, director of Common Cause. "When politicians can secretly take money to undermine their own public positions, democracy itself is at risk." For Jasmine Crockett herself, The exposure of Tim Scott was a career-defining moment that instantly elevated her national profile. Political commentators were already comparing her to legendary congressional investigators like Barbara Jordan and Maxine Waters. Crockett didn't just expose one corrupt politician, wrote Washington Post columnist Jennifer Rubin. She demonstrated how effective oversight is supposed to work. She did her homework, gathered irrefutable evidence, and presented it in a way that left no room for doubt or deflection. Democratic fundraising groups reported that donations were pouring in from across the country, with many donors specifically mentioning Crockett's performance in the hearing. People want to support politicians who will actually fight for accountability, said one Democratic strategist, but Crockett herself seemed focused on the bigger picture. In a statement released after the hearing, she said, "Today wasn't about destroying one person's career, it was about protecting democracy itself. When politicians lie to voters about their most fundamental beliefs, they threaten the entire system." She continued, "Every American, regardless of party, should be outraged that Senator Scott took money to deceive them about his real positions on voting rights. This is exactly the kind of corruption that makes people lose faith in government." The statement concluded with a promise that made both parties nervous. This investigation isn't over. If there are other politicians engaging in similar deceptions, we will find them and expose them too. That promise sent chills through political establishments in both parties. If Crockett had this kind of detailed evidence on Tim Scott, what else might she have discovered? Which other politicians might be hiding similar contradictions between their public and private positions? Late-night comedians were already having a field day with the scandal. Saturday Night Live announced they would be doing a cold open based on a hearing with the actor playing Scott literally crawling under the witness table to hide from Crockett's questions. But for all the jokes and political analysis, the human impact of Scott's betrayal was the most devastating aspect of the scandal. Thousands of black voters who had supported Scott, despite disagreeing with some of his positions, now felt personally betrayed by someone they had seen as representing their community in conservative politics. "It's not just that he disagreed with us," wrote one Twitter user. "It's that he was actively working against us while pretending to understand our struggles. That's not politics. That's betrayal." As the first day after the hearing came to an end, it was clear that American politics had been fundamentally changed. The Scott scandal had exposed not just one corrupt politician, but an entire system that allowed wealthy interests to purchase politicians' private loyalty, while those same politicians maintain contradictory public positions. The question now was whether this exposure would lead to real reform or whether it would simply be forgotten as the next political scandal took center stage. But one thing was certain: Jasmine Crockett had just shown America what real political accountability looked like, and millions of people were demanding more of it. The story was far from over. Congressional ethics investigations were already being discussed. Federal prosecutors were reviewing whether Scott's agreements with Heritage Foundation donors violated any federal laws, and political opponents in both parties were scrambling to make sure they didn't have similar skeletons in their own closets. As for Tim Scott himself, he had disappeared from public view entirely. His staff was refusing all interview requests, and rumors were circulating that he was considering resigning from the Senate, rather than face the ongoing investigations and public humiliation that was sure to come. But regardless of what happened to Scott personally, the damage to political trust was already done. Millions of Americans had watched a respected politician get completely exposed as a fraud. And that kind of betrayal doesn't heal quickly. The biggest question now was whether other politicians would learn from Scott's downfall and start being more honest with voters, or whether they would simply get better at hiding their real agendas. Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: thanks to Jasmine Crockett's fearless investigation, the American people now knew that they couldn't simply trust politicians at their word. They needed to demand proof, transparency, and accountability from everyone they elected to represent them. And if politicians weren't willing to provide that transparency voluntarily, there were representatives like Crockett who were ready to force the truth into the light. No matter how powerful or protected those politicians thought they were, This was democracy working the way it was supposed to work, with fearless representatives holding corrupt officials accountable and giving the American people the truth they deserved, even when that truth was shocking and painful to hear. The Tim Scott scandal was over, but the fight for political accountability was just beginning, and thanks to what everyone was already calling the Crockett Standard, politicians across the country now knew that their private actions and public statements better match up, or they might find themselves facing the same devastating exposure that had just ended one of the Republican Party's brightest careers. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the Scott scandal was how it changed the way Americans viewed political authenticity. For decades, voters have been forced to take politicians at their word, trusting that their public statements reflected their private beliefs. The Scott exposure shattered that assumption completely. Political consultants across Washington were already scrambling to audit their own clients' private communications and financial arrangements. The phrase "pulling a Tim Scott" quickly entered a political lexicon as shorthand for the kind of devastating exposure that could end a career in a single afternoon. Campaign managers were implementing new protocols to ensure their candidates' private positions aligned with their public statements. The Crockett Standard became the new benchmark for political authenticity, with voters demanding proof that their representatives meant what they said. The scandal also highlighted the power of thorough investigative work in an era when many politicians thought they could say anything without consequences. Crockett's meticulous documentation and strategic presentation showed other members of Congress what real oversight looked like. Several campaign finance reform organizations announced they were launching investigations into other politicians who might have similar arrangements with dark money groups. The Scott scandal had opened a door that nobody could close. If one trusted politician could be living a complete lie, how many others were doing the same thing? Universities across the country began incorporating the Scott case into their political science curricula as an example of how modern corruption had evolved beyond simple bribery into sophisticated deception campaigns. Students studying government and politics would now learn about the Scott scandal as a watershed moment when American voters stopped taking politicians' words at face value. The religious community was particularly shaken by Scott's betrayal. As a politician who had frequently spoken about his Christian faith and moral values, his calculated deception struck many believers as especially heinous. Several prominent evangelical leaders who had previously endorsed Scott issued statements withdrawing their support and calling for prayer and reflection about how to better evaluate political candidates' authenticity. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible political stories that expose the truth behind the headlines. The political establishment doesn't want you to see content like this, but we're committed to bringing you the real stories that mainstream media won't cover. Hit that notification bell, so you never miss the latest political bombshells that are shaking up Washington. Remember, this is just the beginning. If Jasmine Crockett has this kind of detailed evidence on other politicians, we could be looking at the biggest political house cleaning in American history. Who do you think she'll expose next? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with everyone who needs to know the truth about what's really happening in our